Pilgrims went on these journeys to show their devotion to God, as an act of penance for their sins, or in hopes of being cured of an illness. A pilgrimage required true dedication, because travel was difficult and often dangerous. Most pilgrims traveled on foot. As robbers were a constant threat, pilgrims often banded together for safety. Sometimes they even hired an armed escort. On popular pilgrimage routes, local rulers built special roads and bridges. Monks set up hostels, guest houses, spaced a day's journey apart. Crusades. The best known of these military expeditions are those to the Holy Land in the period between 1095 and 1291 that were intended to conquer Jerusalem and its surrounding area from Muslim rule. The Crusades were military expeditions to the land where Jesus had lived, which Christians called the Holy Land. This was considered as a sacred service. During the 7th century, this part of the Near East had come under the control of Muslims. Jerusalem, which was a holy city to Christians, Muslims, and Jews alike, became a Muslim city. Between 1095 and 1270, Christians in Western Europe organized several crusades to recover Jerusalem and other sites of pilgrimage. During the 7th century, this part of the Near East had come under the control of Muslims. Jerusalem, which was a holy city to Christians, Muslims, and Jews alike, became a Muslim city. Some went in the belief that doing so would guarantee their salvation. Some people went on crusades to seek wealth, and some to seek adventure. But many crusaders also acted from the deep religious feeling. Geoffrey Chaucer wrote a popular book of verse about pilgrims called the Canterbury Tales. Chaucer lived in England from about 1340 to 1350. His amusing tales are stories that a group of pilgrims tell to entertain each other as they travel to the shrine of St. Thomas Becket in Canterbury. Among Chaucer's pilgrims are a knight, a miller, a cook, and a prioress, the head of a convent, or community of nuns. Pilgrims believed their journeys of devotion earned good graces in the eyes of God. These beliefs served to strengthen the power of the Church. Art and architecture. During the Middle Ages, most art was made for a religious purpose. Paintings and sculptures of Christ and Christian saints were placed in churches to help people worship. Since most people did not know how to read, art helped tell the story of Christ's life in a way everyone could understand. Medieval art and architecture found their most glorious expression in cathedrals, the large churches headed by bishops. The word cathedral comes from the Latin word cathedra, meaning the throne upon which the bishop sat. Cathedrals were built to inspire awe. Often they were taller than a 30-story building today. For centuries, they were the tallest buildings in towns. Most were built in the shape of a cross, with a long central section called the nave and shorter arms called transepts. The cathedrals were built between 1150 and 1250 and were designed in the Gothic style. Gothic cathedrals looked like they were rising to heaven. The defining design element of Gothic architecture is the pointed or ogival arch. The use of the pointed arch in turn led to the development of the pointed rib vault and flying buttresses, combined with elaborate tracery and stained glass windows. The arches spread the massive weight of the roof and walls more evenly. This building technique allowed for taller, thinner walls and more windows. Gargoyles are stone spouts projecting from the rain gutters of the roof. They were usually carved in the form of beasts. In medieval times, some people thought gargoyles were there to warn them that devils and evil spirits would catch them if they did not obey the Church. Art and architecture. The immense space inside the Gothic cathedral was lined with pillars and decorated with religious images. Beautiful stained glass windows made of pieces of colored glass arranged in a design often depicted stories from the Bible. Cathedrals were visible expressions of Christian devotion, mostly constructed by hand. It could take from 50 to 100 years, sometimes more than 200, to complete the cathedral. The interiors of Gothic cathedrals have similar features. The nave leads to the altar area and usually has a cross shape. Beautiful stained glass windows and ribbed vaults are overhead. During the Middle Ages, most schooling took place in monasteries, convents, and cathedrals. This pattern was established under Charlemagne, who encouraged the Church to teach people to read and write. During his reign, scholars developed a new form of writing that helps make reading easier. Instead of writing all letters, as the Romans did, scholars began to use lowercase letters, too. We still use this system today. In medieval times, the clergy were the people most likely to be educated. Most of the students in church schools were sons of nobles who were studying for careers in the clergy. They spent much of their time memorizing prayers and passages from the Bible in Latin. Education. Starting in the 1200s, cathedral schools gave rise to universities. Books at that time were hand-to-hand copying and rare, so teachers often read to students. Students in universities studied Latin grammar and rhetoric, logic, geometry, arithmetic, astronomy, and music. Ancient writers like the Greek philosopher Aristotle taught that reason, or logical thinking, was the path to knowledge. Ancient texts were greatly respected in the universities, but the church taught people to be guided by faith. Ancient writers like the Greek philosopher Aristotle taught that reason, or logical thinking, was the path to knowledge. Thomas Aquinas, an Italian scholar of philosophy and theology, admired Aristotle and tried to bridge the gap between reason and faith. The church later accepted and promoted his teachings. Aquinas wrote logical arguments to show how reason and religious belief worked together. Aquinas saw no conflict between faith and reason. He believed that reason helped people discover important truths about God's creation. His concept of natural law suggested an order in nature that revealed ideas of right and wrong. Natural law could be discovered through reason alone. Natural law agreed with the moral teaching of the Bible since God had created nature. Nearly every day was dedicated to a Christian saint, an event in the life of Jesus, or a religious concept. In medieval Europe, many festivals and fairs marked important days of the year, usually connected in some way to the church. Our word holiday comes from holy day. Christmas and Easter were two of the greatest medieval holidays. During the Middle Ages, Christians celebrated the birth of Christ during Christmas celebrations that lasted for 12 days. Although there were no Christmas trees, homes were decorated with evergreens, holly berries, and mistletoe. On Christmas Day, people attended church and then enjoyed a great feast, often given by the Lord of the Manor. Christians celebrated the resurrection on Easter. This was based on the Christian belief that the resurrection is Christ's rising from the dead. For medieval Christians, Easter was a day of church services, feasting, and games. Often the games involved eggs, a symbol of new life. During holidays, music, dancing, and food were all part of medieval holidays and festivals. People sang folk songs and danced to the music of wooden pipes and drums. They drank wine and ale, strong beer, and they ate baked and fried foods. On special occasions, priests would occasionally act out Bible stories about Jesus' life in addition to the popular plays. They also often enjoyed bonfires, acrobats, jugglers, and dancing bears. In the Middle Ages, Carnival and Lent were important holidays. Lent was a period of 40 days just before Easter when people were especially pious and gave up luxuries, like meat and some drinks. Before the start of Lent, Christians would celebrate with a 3-day festival. In England, mummers, traveling groups of actors, would often perform with masks, drums and bells, dances, and make-believe sword fights. The monastic way of life. Men became monks for many reasons. Some were seeking refuge from war, sickness, or sinfulness. Some came to study, or to live a quiet life of prayer and service. Saint Benedict developed the monastic way of life in 6th century Italy. The Benedictines, as they were known, followed Benedict's rule, or instructions, which involved 3 solemn vows: poverty, chastity, and obedience. Work was especially important to Saint Benedict, who wrote, "To work is to pray." Monks spent their lives in prayer, study, and work, attended 8 church services a day, cared for the poor and sick, taught and copied religious texts. Most monasteries were self-sufficient. They farmed their land, tended gardens, raised livestock, and sewed clothing. Most monasteries had a cloister, a covered walkway surrounding an open square, with a church on the north side, a kitchen and dining hall on the south side, and a dormitory on the third side. Monks, nuns, and mendicants. Monasticism, a way of life in which men and women withdraw from the rest of the world in order to devote themselves to their faith. The monastic life was one of the few options open to medieval women who did not marry. These nuns lived in convents, also called nunneries, which were run like monasteries. Hildegard of Bingen, Germany, was one of many important reformers and thinkers who were nuns. Both monks and nuns joined religious orders, for example, the Benedictines, each with its own distinctive rules and forms of service. She founded a convent, wrote many letters to popes, composed music and wrote books in which she criticized some church practices. Mendicants. People who wanted a religious life without being secluded were called mendicants, a famous example of which is Saint Francis of Assisi. He left his family's wealth behind to serve the poor, and founded the Franciscans, also called the Little Brothers of the Poor. Franciscan friars traveled to preach, and to care for the poor and sick. They lived in poverty, and worked or begged for food for themselves and the poor. For this reason, they were also called mendicants, which means beggar. With his friend Saint Clare, Francis founded an order for women called the Poor Clares. He believed that all living things should be treated with respect, and is often pictured surrounded by animals. His example of faith, charity and love of God is often seen as an ideal form of Christian living. Street. Francis of Assisi lived a simple life with great respect for all living things.